From Iran, there is a book called the Shahnameh. It is the Book of Kings. And in this Book of Kings, you can see represented plenty of people from all around the world. But this is not just the only thing they picked up. If you can see from the artworks, a lot of it has inherited Chinese and Indian illustrations. It depicts wars in interesting ways. It shows the type of things that would have been available at the different times of the history of Iran, including speaking about Alexander the Great as one of its main characters. A growing concern, though, when reading it, is that there is a huge conflation of words that were probably popular during its time, but meant something completely different in previous times. The Ethiopians that are mentioned inside this book are also very interesting, for there are different types of Ethiopians. First of all, Zanj are mentioned, then Habeshas are mentioned, then those who belong to the kingdoms of Candace, but they are not, Candace is not mentioned at all. And then the Egyptians are mentioned, North Africans are mentioned. This is interesting because what we expect from the writings of these Iranians is quite different to what they give us, especially since some of the stuff that we've been told about these people from the Western point of view is a little different. First of all, it's quite clear that the Iranians believe that people from Habshi, and I'll get back to what that means, have been around in Europe for a while, mentioning them existing even in the courts of Alexander. They also seem to mention that these people have also been around in places like the Middle East for longer than what is previously known. So we know that a lot of authors from our day say that the trade between the Middle East and Africa probably started somewhere in the first century. This, of course, is undermined by the fact that Africans have been trading with many different parts of the Middle East for tens of thousands of years, if not more than that. Now, to be fair, this story right here is only part fiction. And I remember it's poetry, or in the format of poetry, but it's more of a novel poetry slash illustration slash everything. And it has some of the best stories that you could possibly read. Somebody from BBC described it as the Bible of Iran. But for me, what it really is a comparison work, one that shows the difference between the opinions of those in the East and the opinions of those of the West when it comes to those of the South. See, they do agree on a lot of things, but they also disagree on a lot of things too. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier that there is a level of ignorance. The level of ignorance shows specific words that we use today. Now, it is curious to know where the ignorance is coming from. Most of the stuff they say about China seems to be fairly accurate. Most of the stuff they say about China, including some of the myths, you can tell they pull directly from the mythology of China. Therefore, you can tell again that the myths that they pull from East Africa comes from East Africa. They probably don't have a deep understanding or even a linguistic understanding, but what I like is there is also an addition in the original text of the Zanji words. So, in other words, when the people in East Africa speak, they translate the words. So, they first give the African writing and then they translate the word. This is interesting because it gives us a glimpse in what they thought. This book is from the 9th century, so this is or the 10th century, 900s, which gives us a very good indicator of what type of world we are talking about. So when I mention a level of confusion, I will talk exactly about it, but first we need to read this piece. It will be obvious to some of you exactly why this level of confusion comes in at this very point if you know your African history. So let's read. From there, Secundar, who is Alexander, remember, went to Abyssinia, the land of the Habesh. The country was crowded with men whose skin was as black as the raven's feathers. Now, firstly, let me pause there because remember, there is these Moors who are described as ravens in this other part. And people say, where do you get this idea that ravens have anything to do with black people? Which, by the way, there's people who already translated at the time, but also you can see over here the comparison. Now, here we are not talking about people who are slightly black. We're talking about people who are absolutely black. That's why they're using the word raven. And these are the Dinka type of people they're talking about, which that will give you a clue, but we'll get back to it. And their eyes as bright as lamps. Now, their eyes aren't as bright as lamps. Their eyes are normal, but the contrast between their skin and their eyes give that impression. They fielded a redoubtable army of tall, naked soldiers, and when they saw Secondar's army approaching, their war cries ascended to the clouds. The king's eyes darkened when he saw them advancing in their thousands. They killed many men as they attacked, hurling bones instead of lances. Secundar ordered his men to prepare their weapons for battle. The naked Habash pressed on with their attack, and many were killed by the Secunda lion like forces until those who survived fled from the battlefield. So much blood was spilled that the land from end to end was like the Sea of China, with here and there mounds of dead piled up. Straw was packed around these heaps of corpses, and Secunda ordered that they be set on fire. So you're probably thinking, well, that's a pretty neat battle that's being thrown there. But there are two things that are obvious in this story. One, Alexander never fought the Habash at all, the Abyssinians. But then, two, clearly they're not talking about the Abyssinians. Who they're talking about are the Sudanese or the North Africans or the Nubians. But here they mistakenly call them Abyssinians, mixing them as a group. Or the second part is there is probably a time in Iran where this word was used for all of them before the word Sudan was utilized. So then the question becomes, what story is this? Well, clearly I can tell by the way that it's written and by the timeline that this is a retelling of the story of Candace, where actually the Africans won against the European armies that were coming down. Alexander was not part of this story. And you can see there where they say they hurl bones, that part is just something that they made up. We all know that the Abyssinians and East Africans in general are known for their bow and arrow skills all across the world. But here they're reduced to a primitive army that runs around naked. This couldn't be further from the truth. Of course, in mentioning places in Africa, they cannot mention places like Ethiopia or even the Zand regions without mentioning the most famous place in history, which is Egypt. Al Biruni, which is someone I'll talk about another time, mentions Egypt several times and the pyramids in detail, which tells us that what they talk about a lot of the times in this European understanding of Egypt as the first time that anybody cared about the history of Egypt is absolute falsehood. In real life, the people who cared about Egypt were people who were in Egypt, no matter what they looked like. Now, we will find several stories, some involving biblical characters like Joseph, describing one of the women of Egypt as a black raven. As you can recall, the word black raven is used to describe black people. Joseph himself not being from Egypt, it's very telling what he is saying here. Unfortunately for the Persians, it is not the same as the West that a lot of people who speak English have studied a lot of their works and been able to work out the pieces and cut things apart. For example, let us take the Bible. So in the Bible, several parts of the book have been spread into smaller sections, and then each piece has been reviewed over and over again. This creates an interpretation. These interpretations that have been shown to exist inside of history as well, making several different versions of history, which are neither correct or incorrect, but show the difficulties of understanding words, have been seen all over Western and other places. But there is still another interpretation, that of the Persians. And in those of the Persians, we still leave out a lot. For, as I mentioned, they mention Ethiopians going as far back as the Bible. They mention Egyptians everywhere. And of course, they intermix, because of their religious affiliation, history with religion. This, of course, being true inside the West as well at the same time period. If we read this from Al-Biruni, we might get exactly what I mean. Further, they relate that the inhabitants of the West, when they were warned by their sages, constructed buildings of the kind of the two pyramids which have been built in Egypt, saying, "If the disaster comes from heaven, we shall go into them. If it comes from the earth, we shall ascend above them." People are of opinion that the traces of the water of the deluge and the effects of the waves are still visible on these two pyramids, halfway up, above which the water did not rise. Another report says that Joseph had made them a magazine where he deposited the bread and the victuals for the years of drought. So, without further reading, I cannot fully discuss exactly the true meaning of this, but we can see that the West is further west than Egypt, and they're talking about pyramids that were later built in construction and mimicry of those of Egypt, and a function is given to them that is different than pyramids that we have seen in Egypt. This is another thing that we need to talk about. What exactly did the Persians, the Arabs, Indians, and all the other people who came before the West believe that the ancient Egyptian pyramids were built for? Did they believe that the pyramids were built, as we do today, to house the dead? Were they aware of this? Did they ever enter the pyramids? And did the people inside of Nubia as well enter the pyramids? Is there more to the story of Africa and the Africans in general than what has been told? Is it inside of the archives of different countries from around the world? Is there something to the many places described by Persians? By the way, there's 4 other books that I found that mention Zanj, Habshi, and other versions of Africans, including those living in North Africa. And these books are fairly interesting because, again, they tell us what they think. Now, remember, in this book, not Al Biruni, but the book that came previously, they mention that the Ethiopians walk naked. But when they talk about the Zanj, they do not talk about them in that way. There is a reason why I bring that up, because there is a huge theory about how everything was discovered further north. And then when you go south, what you would see is people who are barbaric. But the contrast here is very simple. In fact, in Al-Biruni and so many other people's books, they describe the northern parts of Africa as Barbary. Not once do they describe the Zanj regions as Barbary. And there is a reason for that.